Welcome to this session, and the first presenter, the first guest is Susan Joffe, and the title of her paper is An Adult Migration Model of Second Language Motivation. Thank you very much. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Federico. Let me just share my screen. Okay, and okay, fine. It's an honor to be here with all of you today. This study is based on my dissertation research on the roles of motivation and identity in second language proficiency in an adult immigrant population. According to the United Nations, the International Organization for Migration, there are 272 million international migrants in the world, which equals approximately 3.5% of the world's population. This includes voluntary and involuntary migrants and refugees. Of those 272 million souls, 74% are of working age, between the ages of 20 and 64 years. I think that's a surprise to some people who think a lot are children, and of course there are a lot, but the majority are working age people, and that's a lot of people that are simultaneously not learning a second language within a school framework and yet needing to be proficient in their second language in order to support themselves and their families. Just how many of these people need to learn a second language as a result of their migration is a hard question to answer with any specificity because that data point is not tracked to the best of my knowledge. So I wish I could give you a more accurate answer about the number, but we do know that it is enormous. We do know, however, that there are many factors that contribute to second language learning and proficiency, and that motivation is one of them. The importance of motivation in second language learning has been studied extensively for a good 60 years and contributed a lot to our understanding of the second language motivation, primarily of high school students and young adults and college students from many language backgrounds. As far back as the 1950s, Gardner introduced us to the idea that second language learners could be motivated by instrumental motivation or by integrative motivation or some combination. And later, influenced by Ryan and Desi's self-determination theory, Zoltan Dornier expanded our understanding of foreign language students' motivation with the L2 motivational self-theory. The L2 motivational self-theory identified three factors or components to second language motivation, titled the ideal self, the ought to self, and the language learning experience. Studies by researchers from many countries across the world have proven the value of the theory. Briefly, the ideal self is the internally driven desire of language learners to speak a second or foreign language as part of being their best selves. An ideal self statement might be, I see myself as someone who writes reports in a second language, right? My second language. The ought to self component of motivation is externally driven and can be captured by statements such as, I need to speak my second language well, or my parents will be disappointed in me. And the third component, the language learning experience, recognizes that the learning environment itself plays a significant role in motivation. So I enjoy my teacher's lessons would be a statement that reflects this component. So this theory has been tested with student and young adult populations all over the world, as I've said, and proven to be very good at explaining the role of motivation in second language acquisition. My research question was, how would this theory account for the second language motivation of adult immigrants? Would their motivation look like that of the students in the L2 motivational self-studies? How would they be similar? How might they be different? To answer this question, I administered a questionnaire to 300 L1 English-speaking immigrants to Israel. You can see here 33% of the participants were male and 67% were female. All of the research participants immigrated after the age of 18, and therefore they were not part of the high school or the school system. Okay. At the time of the research study, 34% were in their 20s, 24% were in their 30s, 38% in their 40s and 50s, and just 14% were older than 60. At the time of immigration, half of them were under the age of 30, a quarter in their 30s, and then another quarter over the age of 40. All of the participants in the study had lived in Israel for a minimum of 1 year, and the longest that we had was somebody who had lived in Israel for 51 years, okay? But the average length of residence, 48% of the people had lived in Israel for up to 10 years, another 31% up to 20 years, and then another 21% had lived in Israel for more than 20 years. The participants came from different English-speaking countries. 72% came from the United States, 16% from England, 6% from Canada, 4% from South Africa, and 2% from Australia. So those were the participants in the study. Now, the questionnaire that was part of this study included 150 items. But in addition to the motivation section, which is what we're talking about today, there were, of course, biographical questions, and there were sections that related to identity, which we're not talking about today. The motivation section included 43 statements, and participants responded to them on a 5-point Likert scale. In addition, there were oral narratives collected from 55 of the participants in their second language, in Hebrew, both to complement the questionnaire data and to measure second language proficiency. Most of the motivation questions were modeled on the L2 motivational self-constructs, and others tapped into attitudes towards the Hebrew language and Hebrew speakers. Is there a problem with the slides? I'm stopping just for a minute. Freibert, is there a problem with the slides?
Yes, Susan, you are using the presenter mode, so we can see your notes and the coming slides. So if you just go to presenter show, slideshow, we will be able to all see your slide in the screen. Thanks.
Okay, so this is not the right one.
No, it's good, Susan, if you want to go on, yeah.
Okay, okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, the sample statements, sample statements from Ideal Self include, I can imagine myself having a discussion in fluent Hebrew. From the L2 Self presentation, I need to know Hebrew because if I don't, I think my family and friends will be disappointed in me. The language learning experience, I really enjoyed learning Hebrew. These are modeled on the construct of the L2 motivational self. In addition, for Hebrew language and culture, we had statements like, I like Hebrew television programs. Now it says the screen sharing is paused. I apologize about this.
Susan, that was fine. We could see the slides.
Okay.
Yes. So try again.
Okay. All good?
Yes, we can see. Yes, all good.
Okay, and finally, there were items about Hebrew speakers. I like meeting Israelis. So these were the types of questions or statements, I should say, that were part of the questionnaire. Okay, let's see. The data, after it was collected, was cleaned, coded, and analyzed using SPSS 24. It was used for the descriptive statistics, the correlations, the ANOVAs, and then finally, it was used to generate a principal component analysis. The PCA identifies latent groupings of questionnaire items. 5 iterations of the PCA reduced the number of motivation items to 6 components that you see here on the screen, which accounted for the most information from the data set. In the process, the 43 original items were reduced to 23 variables. Here you can see the components identified along with their Cronbach's alpha scores. Now, the results of the PCA were then used to do a confirmatory factor analysis using Amos 23. And the confirmatory factor analysis yielded a 3-factor model, which included 15 variables or the questionnaire items. So here is the model. Okay, it includes these 3 factors: a linguistic factor, which tapped into positive attitudes towards the use of the Hebrew language, professional, which was an instrumental type motivation, and social or positive attitudes towards interacting with Hebrew speakers. The largest of the 3 factors, of course, is the linguistic factor, with 9 questionnaire items loaded on. The other 2 factors, professional and social, each included 3 items. I'll get to those in a minute. The numbers at the heads of the arrows, these numbers here are not particularly relevant. They have to do with some of the way that the statistics are run. But what is important here is these numbers here to the left of the ovals, which connect the individual items with the model factor. And these are considered validity values, and anything over a 0.7, just like with a Pearson correlation, is considered highly significant. They're absolute values, so I don't know how well you can see this on your computer screen, but some of them are negative because the question is worded in a negative way, or the questionnaire item. So these, for all 3, are the validity values of the items being part of the factor. These numbers over here on the arcs or the arrows with that point at both ends reflect a correlation between the different factors, and the low numbers tell us that in fact they're measuring different values and are in fact different phenomena. Now, I'm not going to go through all of 15 items, but I will, excuse me, I will show you an example of some of these items so that it sort of brings it into reality. So these are
so
items.
I take a chance to tell you that you go 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Federico. So here are some of the items that reflect a positive attitude towards the linguistic motivation. Here are some towards the professional motivation. And finally, here are some for the social motivation. These are some of the selected fit measures for the model. I won't waste time on that. Okay, this is without all of the numbers and statistics on it. This is a presentation of the adult immigrant second language motivation model. It includes these 3 components: the linguistic motivation, professional motivation, and social motivation. Now, I think it's worth noting these important features of the model. Under the linguistic motivation, the linguistic motivation in an adult population appears to be independent of identity. Whereas we know from developmental psychologists that adolescents and young adults still have emerging identities, adults' identities are mostly fixed. And therefore, the motivation of these adult immigrants to improve their second language proficiency is not about becoming a better person, an ideal person, a person who speaks the second language well. It's about just enjoying the ability to use the language and the opportunities that become available to proficient speakers. The professional motivation, in addition to being truly professional in its orientation, is in general practical. In oral interviews, participants discuss the need for second language proficiency to access the healthcare system, to pay their bills, to communicate with their children's schools, etc. Excuse me. The social describes current and not future use of social purposes, of using the language for social purposes. We saw no evidence of external motivation on any of these constructs, which is a big difference with the student model. To understand the differences between this model and the student model, we need to consider that these changes happen naturally over the lifespan. In some ways, we are looking at what happens to motivation at the next stage of life. So this is something to consider to help us understand why these two models look very different. Well, I skipped here. Yeah, I didn't. Okay. So to summarize, we have a three-factor model, and the factors include linguistic motivation, instrumental motivation, and social motivation. I think it's really important, moving over to discussing some of the research issues, that we need to study more migrants of all these different types across their ages and stages of their lifespan, which is one reason I was very excited to be on the panel together with people that are looking at migrants and language issues involving healthcare, involving education, involving literacy. I think we need to be doing all of these things. I also think we need to acknowledge that in working with these populations, we need methodologies that meet our needs as social scientists while acknowledging the complexities of their lives. So it is almost impossible to study variables such as length of exposure, age of acquisition. Those are just things we can't control as variables when we work with immigrant populations or migrants in general. We need to measure proficiency and not acquisition because we don't have these bookends in order to do our research. And we need methods that will allow us to feel like we have integrity to our methodology and to our results, while acknowledging that they don't fit well in the categories of students and people in more stable frameworks. So I look forward to discussing all these issues with you, anybody who's interested in the future, and thank you very much. Okay.
Very much, Susan. We learned so much from your paper, and actually you introduced many variables that can be very useful and then can be discussed further. We do have a question, actually. We had a question that came a few minutes ago. Jess is asking you, do any of these questions assess how anxious they might feel using the language?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Some of them did, but none of those answers really loaded at a high level onto any of the statistical analyses. I certainly had it come up in the oral interviews that I did. People expressed anxiety about telling me a story in Hebrew. There were a whole section of questions, 6 questions that were based on willingness to communicate, right? That whole model of thinking. So participants talked about whether they felt anxious communicating in a small group or in a big group, whether it mattered whether they were friends or acquaintances or strangers. None of the results from those were significant, and I'm not actually surprised, because while those are really valid questions, I'm not sure how different that is between their second language and their first language, right? A lot of people are uncomfortable speaking in many of these situations in their first as well as their second language. But we did look at that.
Susan, if I'm not wrong, you already answered to Valeria's question. You saw it coming.
Yeah, I thought that's what you asked me. You asked about anxiety, right?
No, sorry, because you mentioned L2. So we have another question from Valeria, and she's asking you, have you studied something related to methodologies to work with adult migrants, especially when learning an L2?
So, so the thing is, most migrants aren't learning L2s. They're in situations where they're acquiring, right? They're in an immersion. They're being exposed to a language, but most adults are not. Immigrants are not in situations where they have prolonged opportunities to study their second language. Here in Israel, we have an Ulpan system. New immigrants are entitled to 5 months of intensive Hebrew classes, but most places aren't giving even that much. And if people are tapping into courses, it's in a very unsystematic way. So when you have a population that is in some sort of structured learning environment, it's a great opportunity to be studying them. But to sort of look at the population as a whole, that's probably not the best way to go about trying to understand their second language acquisition or proficiency, or whichever term you want to use.
Thank you very much, Susan. If I'm not wrong, Tony Capstick, another speaker, one of our speakers today, wanted to expand on that answer. Tony, am I right? I saw that you wanted to say something. Yes, please, Tony.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I was struggling with the Q&A chat function, so this is great to be able to ask the question. Thanks, Susan. That was really interesting talk. My question is a point you made at the end there about measuring proficiency. I mean, migrant, as you obviously you talked about, migrants have very complex trajectories and often quite translingual practices, quite hybrid repertoire. So my controversial question is how do we measure proficiency when there is that such complexity in their repertoires?
Yeah, so I love your question. I guess I would sort of turn it back to you a little bit before I answer and say, well, what's your goal, right? What are you trying to get out of the answer to that question, right? When we're talking about a school framework, so when we measure, acquisition, or we measure proficiency, so we can link that, or ideally we can link that to academic performance, to ability to succeed in some sort of educational framework. When we're talking about, immigrants, so we need to know what we're measuring, and, for what purpose? What do we need this number for? Does it help us choose whether people, are eligible for job training programs? Does it help us choose somehow who we want to give citizenship to? Like there's all kinds of bodies who will have all sorts of interests in, in that score or whatever that is. And we kind of need to know who wants to know before we decide, don't you think? I mean,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you remind me of that. I mean, having spent a long time in language education, I'm now more outside classrooms. And so finding ways to move between what we know about what migrants do outside a classroom setting and draw on that in our classroom teaching is always going to be very tricky. But you're right, it's about the educational framework we're working with. So thank you.
Sure. Good question.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much, Susan, for this dialogue. There's another question from Gunnar, if I pronounced that correctly. Otherwise, apologies, Gunnar. Susan, can you read that? Because it's a bit longer, so it's better if you read that. It's about labels, the labels that you have used during your paper.
So she's asking, is Gunnar, I don't know if Gunnar is a male or female, the person, Gunnar Jacob, is asking if I've considered alternative labels for the components, which are conceptually not so strongly related. So yes, I've considered different labels for these components. Yes. And I initially called them positive attitudes towards Hebrew, positive attitudes towards Hebrew speakers, right? I considered different types of things. I considered instrumental versus professional, instead of professional. Partly, again, this is, I guess, a little bit related to Tony's question. Partly, the labels were a reflection of, I started out by comparing the motivation of this population to an existing model out there in the literature. So I wanted to see where, these people converged with that model and where they diverged from that model. And I hope that's what I emphasized after presenting the model and highlighting, what was sort of unique or new or, something additional to add to the conversation about second language motivation. So to a large extent, it was built, I guess, in relation to that other model. But if you have suggestions for how you think we should label it differently or think about it differently, I'd love to hear that.
Susan, can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Yeah, you said that, already in your paper, but can you just expand on the way in which you discuss these, well, not just the labels, but the methodology with the people that you interview? So to what extent are they aware of what you're doing with them? I mean, it's not just a matter of designing a new methodology, a new way of, talking about motivation, but it's also a matter of sharing these with the people you're working with. Can you just expand a little bit on that? To what extent are they aware of this process? When you work with.
So in terms of the narratives, I really specifically didn't want to give people tests. I didn't think they were going to respond well to tests. I thought some people might just plain refuse them. So I went with oral narratives, in part because I felt they were more user-friendly to the participants. But another reason is I sort of believe in them in terms of an oral narrative, when somebody's speaking, it's telling us how well they speak, and I'm not so interested because, as I was saying to Tony, I'm not so interested in their school abilities, their reading abilities. I want to know their communicative abilities. And so, and I sort of followed Leboeuf's model. I asked them, tell me a story about when you immigrated. Well, everyone has those stories and they're emotionally rich. And people start telling you those stories and they forget about monitoring their language. And you get a very authentic sample of somebody's speaking abilities. And by focusing on them and their experiences and giving them that control, they're engaged and they're very happy to participate in the research process. A lot of people, nobody had problems telling me stories. Some people didn't love the questionnaire. It was long. They were forced to, choose between these 5 options on a Likert scale. But sometimes people would say to me, oh, it was too long. But then they would write me what the equivalent of a 4-page email, pouring out their hearts about how they feel about, motivation and identity and their second language and what it means to be an immigrant and what have you. So, I think people really want to participate in talking about these topics, and if we can find a way that's encouraging to them, that lets them know they've got a voice and that you're interested in their voice, I think they cooperate very well and they're very enthusiastic about being part of it.